This is the much discussed Two Rivers Regional Detention Facility here in Hardin, Montana. It's the center of a great deal of controversy, and I think that that's entirely appropriate. By way of explaining that, I'd like to tell you a little story. There's a book by Armando Valladares, who was imprisoned in Cuba for over 2 decades as a political prisoner. And in his memoir, Against All Hope, Mr. Valladares recounts the story of a Cuban dictator who lived before Fidel Castro, who built a very large prison facility, much larger than anything that would be needed for his regime. And it remained empty for a number of years. And this dictator was asked why he had built such a grandiose structure that was obviously much greater in terms of its capacity than anything that would be needed. Why do you have an empty prison sitting somewhere in your government? And the dictator said, well, don't worry, somebody will come along who will fill it up. Well, that's really the implicit promise of this structure. It's empty right now. There are 464 beds in this facility, and it's standing on a very large tract of land that is easily big enough to house all kinds of additional detention facilities, or, as the so-called American police force has suggested, a training facility for both military and police officials. And of course, there's some reason for concern that they would commingle those functions, and that's pretty much typical of what's going on right now in American law enforcement. Some of the features of this facility that I think are worth mentioning are the following. You've got a double-layer fence here, brand new, as of a couple of years ago, and it's started to rust in a couple of places here, but once again, this is a facility that's not been used, and it's still in very good repair. But you notice that there are coils of concertina razor wire, several coils along each of these fences. There are 2 in the internal fence, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a total of 7 along the secondary fence. And at the top, of course, you've got barbed wire, both on the internal and the external fence. And this is supposedly a facility that would be the equivalent of a county jail for minimum security offenders. At least that's what the publicity says. It's more akin to what you would find in a really high security prison complex. This is referred to as a jail. I think prison is a better term for it, given its size and given the nature of the security features here. Behind me, there's an odd little sign saying, notice, no hostages will exit through this gate. It's in bilingual terms here. It's in English and Spanish. By hostages, I would assume they're talking about visitors. I've been to Fort Leavenworth on a couple of occasions as a visitor, but they never referred to me as a hostage when I visited Fort Leavenworth. So I'm not entirely sure what that refers to. Over here, there's another sign. Once again, it's in English and Spanish, talking about the fact that by entering this facility, you're giving your implicit permission that you will be subjected to a search of your person and your property. If you refuse that search, then they won't let you in. Over here on what I guess is the north side of the facility, there's a very large double-gated entryway that appears to be the equivalent of a port, if you will, for allowing vehicular traffic in. It's big enough to accommodate a bus. And if you have a bus that drives in through the first gate, I would assume that they'd close the gate behind it, and then they would keep the bus inside while people are being searched, or people are being brought out one by one if they're prisoners or detainees. Once again, when I went to Fort Leavenworth in 1984, they had an entryway that was similar to this, and that, by the way, once again, illustrates why I consider it to be a misnomer to refer to this as a jail. It's a prison. It seems to be reflecting some of the features that you'd find in a place like Fort Leavenworth, which is a maximum security prison. And it's an odd sight to see a jail sitting empty, or a prison sitting empty in the outskirts of a small town in Montana, and to know that there are people who have reposed their economic hopes for this community on this facility. The operative expression being, I suppose, if you build it, they will come. If you build an empty prison, eventually somebody will be brought along to fill it up. And that, I think, once again, is really the kernel of this story. It's not so much what's going on with the so-called American police force, which seems to be headed up by a guy who's a penetrable fraud and con man. It's the fact that this lovely little town of Hardin, Montana, about 3,400 people or thereabout, located here in Bighorn County. It abuts the Crow Reservation, which I guess is over this direction a couple of miles, and that becomes Custer County, Montana, if I remember my geography correctly. It's something I was just learning over the last couple of days. If I got it wrong, please forgive me. I'll correct myself, I promise you. But this town, of course, like so many other little towns here in the West, is economically depressed. And they were looking for a new industry in order to bring new blood, new economic lifeblood into the community. And the Two Rivers Authority, which is this quasi-private institution set up by the municipal government, decided that they would build a jail on the assumption a couple of years ago that they'd take advantage of what you call the detention boom. And the detention boom never really materialized for Hardin, and so they ended up with an empty jail. And an empty jail, of course, is going to attract trouble in the form of the so-called American police force here in Hardin. But eventually, after the $27 million in bonds that were issued by the TRA here, which are already in default, go irrecoverably into default, somebody's probably going to end up foreclosing on this facility. It's going to be somebody's property, and somebody's going to be using it for something. And those are the questions I think that most trouble me, and that should trouble people, is the fact that you've got an empty jail here, and most likely elsewhere in this country you're going to find empty jails somewhere that will have to be filled up. And government's very good at doing that kind of thing. And therein, I think, lies the real problem.
Oops. Let's see, how much time do I have here?
This is pause here.
Okay. Well, that's no good. That's too fast, too. Think you need a jail this big for a city this size?
Sorry.